Good afternoon. I'm Jim McSweeney, President of the CIP Group. I want to thank everyone for taking the time out of their busy schedule to join us today for our CIP webinar as we discuss the effects of COVID-19 on employees and businesses. The goal of CIP during this crisis will be to serve as a stabilizing, constructive force, leveraging our resources and connections to best support our friends during these trying and unprecedented times. During today's webinar, you will have an opportunity to ask questions within our chat box. We'll keep this webinar to 1 hour, so if we're unable to answer your questions within that time slot, be assured that your questions will be answered and advice will be forthcoming. Jay Morrissey will be moderating our webinar today. Jay is our Director of HR Services and has over 25 years of experience in professional services, nonprofits, and education. He holds a master's in labor relations and an MBA. Without further delay, I'd like to introduce Jay Morrissey. Jay? Jay, you ready?
Oh, I am sorry, I had you on mute. I apologize.
Okay.
There's 4 points I want to make before we get started, which is one, this is an evolving situation. There's a lot of moving parts. So what we will focus on today is what we now know about the virus, what we now know about labor law and current best practice as best we can. Talk about upcoming legislation as best we can. A lot of this is subject to move and change. Secondly, there's certain industry-specific sectors that may have other additional requirements to address. We're not going to be able to get to all of those, although if you have specific questions about your industry, follow up via the chat box and we will do our best to answer them for you. This is going to be Massachusetts specific in terms of a lot of the content. We recognize a lot of our partners and friends, clients have locations outside of Massachusetts. If you need additional information, we will work with you to get that information as well. Last, if you have any specific benefits, claims, or HR questions related to the application of coronavirus situations to your benefits plans or your workplace, let us know via rapid response at Ask CIP. We'll try to get you information as quickly as possible. Okay, now if I can move my slide. Our topics for today is what we currently know, recommended strategies in the workplace, additional measures in response and support, what we can do to support employees, what are the existing employment laws about which you should be concerned, what are the changes to unemployment guidance from both the federal and the state, what are the evolving responses from the federal government and the Commonwealth. Again, this is preliminary information that's changing frequently, so we will be monitoring that and communicating out for you. We'll work through some federal leave scenarios based on what we do know about the evolving responses, provide an FAQ about what happens in what situation, and we'll provide you some small business supports as well. So what do we know? The current coronavirus is not been previously identified. It's in the same family as coronaviruses that cause common colds, cause mild illnesses, but it is much more contagious than similar viruses. So it's thought to spread mainly from person to person, generally within 6 feet of each other. May be transmitted by touching infected surfaces and then touching the surface of your face. On average, the person spreads to 2 to 3 others. So this is where the effect of self-quarantining and social distancing matters in containing the virus. As of yesterday afternoon, there were 218 confirmed cases. So what do we know? We know that Middlesex, Suffolk, and Norfolk counties are contain the plurality of confirmed cases. The plurality of exposure vectors occurred from the Biogen conference, which speaks to the proximity of others who may be affected. So, what are some of the recommended strategies to employ right now? If you haven't already, please start doing these things. OSHA calls these administrative controls. These are things you can do administratively without engineering changes. Actively encourage sick people to stay home. Inform them to self-monitor for signs and symptoms of COVID-19 and its possible exposure. That means knowing what those possible symptoms are. Those are available through the CDC. We'll provide you some information elsewhere in this presentation to them. Separate sick employees. If you notice somebody who's demonstrating symptoms of the COVID infection, separate them, send them home. Emphasize respiratory etiquette. What this generally means is reinforce the notion that you should be washing your hands when you go to the bathroom, washing your hands frequently, sanitizing them where possible, wiping down workstations, covering your mouth when you sneeze. Perform routine environmental cleaning. Get in there. Remember, the virus is transmitted through touching infected surfaces. Make sure that your folks are wiping down workplaces, wiping down their phones, wiping down their computers. Because what will happen is if somebody who's infected touches that surface and then somebody else comes and touches their face, as ones want to do, that will transmit the virus. Limit numbers of people in open air offices to 25 or fewer, perhaps even 10. This forces you to really think about how your office operates. Really start thinking about whether or not you can telecommute. Who do you need to have on hand? To that point, you should be assessing the feasibility of those work at home arrangements. Identify critical employees. What are your staffing requirements? Who do you need to have on hand to maintain and continue your operations? Discourage folks from using other people's phones, desks, offices, touching their mobile phones, things of that kind. Last, if you're open for business to the public, make sure that you've got a written mandatory cleaning process in place. Tell folks how often you're cleaning the facilities that are open to the public. Some additional measures in response to potential exposure. Request that employees who are well, but who have a sick family member at home, tell their supervisor. Refer to CDC guidance in terms of how to conduct a risk assessment for their potential exposure. Again, we will provide you some information, specifically a link to the CDC self-risk assessment. This is important. If an employee is confirmed to have COVID-19, employers should inform employees of their possible exposure to the disease in the workplace, but you also have to maintain confidentiality as required by the ADA. So you cannot answer the question, who's got it? Again, to that point, that makes it more important that you're engaging these cleaning behaviors and hygiene behaviors. Employees who may be exposed to a coworker with confirmed COVID should refer to those CDC guidelines about the risk assessment to determine what actions they should be taking for their potential exposure. The common theme here is you need to be familiar with the risk assessment rubric. We will be pointing you as to where you can get that information. Additionally, in Massachusetts, you can contact the State Department of Public Health for questions about conducting risk assessment. Earlier in the week, late last week, they were being very responsive. An epidemiologist would call back pretty quickly. As this begins to escalate, the time delay may be increased. So what can you do in response to support your employees? Be aware of folks' concern about their pay, leave, safety, and health, and other issues that may arise during these disease outbreaks. Folks are going to be worried about their health, not only their health, but their income. What are they going to do going forward, particularly since this is an undefined duration? You want to make sure that you're providing usable and appropriate training and education, and really communicating out to folks about what we know, reinforcing the behaviors that they can engage to keep themselves safe or safer, to limit the exposure. What we find is informed people who feel safe at work are less likely to be unnecessarily absent. So people that are afraid that they're going to contract virus, become sick, they're the folks that are most likely to call out from work if they feel more educated, they feel like you've got your procedures in place, they're going to be less likely to do that. Additionally, if you maintain an LTD policy, many have employee assistance program components to them. They can be particularly valuable during unsettled times in terms of counseling, in terms of referrals to mental health services, doctors, and the like. So we have several employment laws in place that are affected by this situation, some that could be engaged elsewhere, but in specific, we've got Massachusetts sick leave law that govern how folks accrue time, who accrues time, who gets paid for that time. There's also the Federal Family Medical Leave Act that deals with employees of 50 or more within a 75-mile radius who worked 1,250 hours over the last year. There are certain job protections associated with that. There's certain interactions with that the current outbreak has. Just about everybody on this call has what's called a general duty provision of the OSHA Act. Requires employers to maintain and assure healthful and safe working conditions. Now, workers who contract the virus under work-related conditions may also be eligible for workers' comp. We'll deal with that later in the presentation. Last, there's the issue of a direct threat under Equal Employment Opportunity laws, under the Americans with Disabilities Act. What that means is that certain provisions of EEO law and anti-discrimination law, disability discrimination law, are relaxed under the pandemic, which means that we can engage certain questions and behaviors and do certain things that we might not otherwise be able to do. So for instance, if folks have displaying symptoms such as fever, chills, cough, you may ask folks, if they've been exposed, you may ask folks to leave. You may take certain other measures that you may not otherwise be able to do, absent the pandemic. Which is to say that some of the guidance here will change depending on whether or not this is considered a pandemic. Now, the Department of Labor last week issued guidance for unemployment in these situations. States can pay benefits when an employer temporarily closes due to the viral outbreak and employees can't work. For instance, the current moratorium on sit-down dining. Can pay when an employee is quarantined but expects to work when the quarantine is over. An employee leaves his or her job due to a risk of exposure or infection or to care for a family member. We're going to address what risk of exposure means elsewhere in this presentation. So keep this in mind. Federal law doesn't require employees to quit their jobs in order to receive unemployment insurance benefits related to the statute. You don't need to lose your job to get benefits. We'll talk a little bit about that as well. Employees who are receiving paid sick leave or paid family leave would generally not be considered unemployed because they're still receiving pay. So that would likely make them ineligible for unemployment benefits while receiving a pay. We're going to talk a little bit about that as we go. Massachusetts has a couple of different things to talk about here. There's folks that are currently with current unemployment claims. There are implications here for them. So there's, generally speaking, there's requirements regarding attending seminars at career centers. Those have been suspended. If you miss deadlines due to the effects of COVID-19, that would be considered good cause for missing the deadline. They're going to excuse lateness, and appeal hearings will be held by telephone only, so no in-person appeals. Now, under the federal guidance we discussed earlier, the state is going to pay unemployment benefits if a worker is quarantined due to an order by a civil authority or medical professional, or if that person leaves employment due to a reasonable risk of exposure or infection. I'm going to talk about this upcoming. If the person is reduced in hours or not working to care for a family member and does not intend to or is not allowed to return to work, and then the worker need not provide medical documentation, need only be available for work when asked if the work is available. Now, there are emergency regulations to allow people impacted by COVID to collect unemployment benefits if the workplace is shut down and expects to reopen. So this will apply to all employees, full and part-time, who are impacted by those shutdowns. These conditions are: workers must remain in contact with their employers during the shutdown. Workers must be available for any work their employer may have for them that they're able to do. An employer may request to extend the period of time covered of the covered shutdown to 8 weeks, and workers will remain eligible for the longer period under the same conditions described above, that they're in contact and they're able to work. And if necessary, the state may extend those time periods beyond that. Now, as I mentioned earlier, if a person contracts the virus for any work-related reason, that person could be eligible for workers' comp. So if that person qualifies, you could receive payments to partially replace that paycheck and for medical care, which is why it's really important to engage those cleaning and exposure protocols discussed earlier in the presentation. Now, the federal government has some evolving responses here. There's Emergency Unemployment Insurance Stabilization and Access Act. There's the paid sick leave. There's paid family medical leave. Again, these are not yet passed into law. They've passed the House. They've actually passed the House twice now, based on advice from the Senate. They've made some corrections and tweaks that may be further tweaked and changed. But the paid family medical leave would be a temporary expansion of FMLA. So it provides 12 weeks of job-protected paid family medical leave, of which the first 14 days may be unpaid. Employees who worked for the employer for 30 days prior, with fewer than 500 employees, and has a qualifying reason to be eligible. So there's no requirement of 12 months, 1,250 hours, none of that. Provides up to 12 weeks of job protected leave paid after the first 10 days. Paid sick leave. employers with fewer than 500 employees will be required to provide full-time employees 2 weeks of paid sick leave for specific circumstances related to COVID-19, self-isolation, doctor's visits, other quarantine effects. The Unemployment Stabilization Act would provide $1 billion in emergency grants to allow states to process and pay increased unemployment benefits. Now, Massachusetts has also responded with emergency regulations for unemployment that deals with if the workplace is shut down and expects to open in 4 or fewer weeks, workers must remain in contact. We've discussed that. Available for work any employer may have. Do not otherwise have to be looking for work. The whole point is social distancing, self-quarantining, staying away from other folks because it's highly contagious. The idea is we don't want them out looking for work where they will presumably encounter other folks. So, talking about the emergency paid family medical leave, full-time employees may take emergency paid sick leave for the first 80 hours of EFMLA, that's the Emergency Family Medical Leave Act leave, so that is paid. Employees may also elect to use other accrued paid leave, vacation, PTO, during the first 10 days. You cannot require that to occur. And after the first 10 days, the leave would be compensated at 2/3 the regular rate. As it currently exists, pay would be capped at $200 a day and $10,000 in aggregate per employee. Eligibility for EFMLA and FMLA, parenthetically, for other non-COVID-19 related reasons. So if you're a covered employer under Family Medical Leave Act, the eligibility for both would be 12 weeks total. This may mean the use of the paid leave, the emergency paid leave, may affect eligibility under traditional FMLA or vice versa. Now, I'm noting right here in brackets that this is something that the Senate might try to change. The intention here, at least the House intention, was to make this in addition to traditional FMLA. As it's currently worded, FMLA previously used would affect eligibility for the emergency FMLA. So if somebody had been out for 10 weeks previous and now comes ill, they, as it currently exists, they would be eligible for 2 weeks of emergency FMLA. Evolving, this may change. Part-time employees, variable hour folks, will be entitled to pay based on the average number of hours they worked or the average number of hours they would normally be scheduled to work if they've been there for less than 6 months. Now, there's no specific new notice requirement as it currently exists. Just bear in mind that under the FMLA covered employers, those with 50 or more employees in a 75-mile radius, must display a general notice, the FMLA poster about the FMLA. If you have one of those all-in-one posters, that would meet that. Now, employees are required to give notice where foreseeable to the employer. However, bearing in mind the nature of emergencies, it's not always foreseeable. Keep that in mind. As it's currently written, the law would go into effect no later than 15 days after the enactment of the law, which is to say, approved by the House, the Senate, signed by the President, or a veto overridden by the Senate. Regardless, it's expected that this will pass in some manner, shape, or form. You'll have 15 days to comply. So in the matter of those next 2 weeks, we will have to be figuring out how to comply, what all the regulations are. This is evolving. We're staying on top of it. We're going to be providing you the best possible best practice going forward, and we're paying attention to the situation. Employers subject to the requirements are entitled to a tax credit the amount of the paid family medical leave requirements paid by the employer. Tax credits for qualified wages are capped at $200 per day, $10,000 per calendar quarter per employee. The tax credits are applied against employer Social Security taxes, but employers are reimbursed if their costs for qualified leave exceed the taxes you owe. So right now you're probably thinking, what do I do about cash flow? That's also something that might be changed as this progresses. Again, it's rapidly evolving. The emergency paid sick leave currently deals with employers with 1 to 499 employees. Any employee who works for the employer is eligible. No minimum days or hours of employment are required. One of the things that is likely going to change is that cap of 499 employees. I think the intention here was addressing folks that may not otherwise be covered, and employers of 500 or more generally have more ability to provide more benefits, rich paid time off, which may or may not be a good assumption. So someone is looking at that as well. If the employee is sick, the employee is entitled to 80 hours of paid sick time. Part-time employees are paid on the average number of hours they've worked in the last 6 months prior to taking leave. Or if paid less than 6 months, the average number of hours per week that you would normally be scheduled. So there's a lot of overlap there with the medical leave. So the employer must provide paid sick time to the extent the employee is unable to work or telework. Again, if you're working from home and you're actually working, that's a different situation. Due to a need for leave because of the coronavirus. At the employee's regular rate, capped at the following levels: $511 per day and $5,110 in aggregate per person for the following qualifying reasons. The employee is subject to local quarantine. They've been advised by a healthcare provider to self-quarantine due to concerns with the COVID, or the employee is experiencing symptoms of COVID-19 and seeking medical diagnosis. So under those three reasons, they would be paid up to $511 per day, $5,110 in aggregate under paid sick leave. They would be paid 2/3 of the regular rate and capped at $200 a day and $2,000 in aggregate if they were out for caring for an individual subject to self-quarantine, caring for a son or daughter whose childcare or school is closed, is experiencing any other substantially similar condition, which is basically catch-all. It says cold, flu, whatever. So the reason that somebody's out for a sick leave determines how much money they may be eligible for. I imagine that part of the response going forward, once this passes and everything's set, would be pay codes associated with what type of leave and at what rate they're being compensated for purposes of tracking the reimbursement mechanism that results from the statutes. Now, one of the questions that comes up is, can somebody just simply refuse to work? An employee's right to refuse to do a task or do a job or come into work is protected if all of the following conditions are met. So there's 4 conditions here, all have to be met. Where possible, the employee has asked the employer to eliminate the danger and the employer has failed to do so. The employee has refused to work, quote, in good faith. This means that they must genuinely believe that an imminent danger exists. You must be able to articulate why there's the danger must be able to show that there's some causal connection between the current situation and the danger that may exist. Belief is probably not enough. A reasonable person would agree that there's a real danger of death or serious injury. Reasonable person. And last, there isn't enough time due to the urgency of the hazard to get it corrected through the regular enforcement channels, such as requesting an OSHA inspection. If there is an engineering control that would have to be employed to remediate a dangerous situation, that would be a reason for somebody to refuse to work. If it's a simple administrative control that we talked about earlier, that's a much different situation. So if there are all four of these conditions are met, somebody could refuse to work and not be disciplined or face consequences for it. Now, be mindful here, though, that if employees act collectively, even if it's not in good faith, even if it's not a case where a reasonable person would agree that there's real danger of death or serious injury, even in that situation, if employees act collectively for their collective health and welfare, it could cause an interaction with the National Labor Relations Act, Section 7. So be mindful of that. So, assuming that the paid emergency sick leave passes as currently constituted. One scenario is this. Sally has been employed full-time for 20 days at a call center which employs 40 people. She's not eligible to receive any paid time under her employer's policies. She's got a sore throat and a fever of just over 100 degrees and cannot report to work. She's waiting to be seen by her doctor. So to what benefits is she entitled while she's not working? If this passes as currently constituted, she would be eligible for 80 hours of sick time under her regular rate. She would not be eligible for emergency family medical leave because she was not employed for at least 30 days prior to that first day of her leave. She's been there for 20 days. Sally has been employed now full-time for 45 days at a call center, which employs those same 40 people. As of today, Sally has accrued 3 days of paid sick time off under her employer's policies. The school where her daughter attends is closed until the end of April. She's now unable to work from home during this time. So to what benefits is she entitled under this scenario? Well, she'd be entitled to the 80 hours of her regular rate of pay as emergency sick leave because her sick leave accounted for the full rate of pay. Emergency family and medical leave, up to 12 weeks of protective leave. The first 10 days is unpaid, but again, under the scenario, it would be paid under emergency sick leave. After the first 10 days, Sally is now paid at 2/3 her regular rate, and she may use her 3 days of PTO after the initial 10 days, but is not required to. So there are a few things happening here that will cause some kind of analysis, and we'll have to figure out how this actually plays out, but that's the net effect. This is somebody that's been there for 45 days, has potentially up to 3 months of job protected leave. There are some existing small business support resources. They're limited in scope to small business, but there's a $10 million small business recovery loan fund created for Massachusetts employers that will provide emergency capital up to $75,000 to Massachusetts business impacted by COVID-19. Those folks would have to be under 50 full and part-time employees, but they do include nonprofits. So they'd be available to eligible businesses with no payments due for the first 6 months. They're immediately available. There's a website, a URL there, empoweringsmallbusiness.org. At the end of this presentation, there is a substantial number of additional links and resources that we'll be providing and we'll make available. So you can complete the application online, or you can email it in the subject line to a specific email address. Additionally, the federal government, the Small Business Administration, has low interest federal disaster loans available as well. Currently, what I saw was Connecticut was eligible as primary counties, with secondary counties extending into Massachusetts by virtue of their proximity to the primary affected counties. Those counties are Berkshire, Hampden, and Worcester counties. So there's some available money through the Small Business Administration. There's an email address and a website URL for further information as well. Now, I have some frequently asked questions we can go through. And the thing I like about this is that we can get into some of the rationale behind the answers. Now, I have heard from the previous presentation of this presentation, it would be really good to have some of that rationale there. For space purposes, I did not include it. We will make that conversation available as well. All right. So these answers are good as long and until the federal legislation we discussed about family emergency leave, family sick time become effective. I'm not sure I know how those two statutes would affect the answers here, but we can only do what we now know. So if an employee shows up to work with coronavirus-like symptoms, can I require them to go home? The answer is yes, right? So the CDC recommends that employees who arrive at work showing symptoms be sent home immediately. Remember your general duty clause. So sending an employee home who's demonstrating, coronavirus-like symptoms would almost certainly fall under the umbrella of an employer's duty to furnish a safe workplace. So without even answering the question, do I get paid? Do I have sick time? Do I have anything available? Your general duty overrides some of those things. You may wish to be flexible with your application of policy, but the OSHA general duty to provide a safe workplace overrides that. In addition, you don't want anyone else getting sick in the workplace for workers' comp issues. Don't forget that the EEOC would say that sending an employee home demonstrating symptoms of an illness would be permissible because it would not necessarily constitute a disability under the ADA. Even if it did, though, even if it was severe enough to be disabling, we have a justifiable threat, direct threat in the workplace analysis. So no matter how you slice that up, whether or not it's an OSHA concern, whether or not it's an equal employment opportunity / disability issue, the idea is pandemic overrides, get that person home. Can I require an employee who's been out of the office as a result of the coronavirus to provide a doctor's note certifying the employee is fit to work? Now, Massachusetts has a stipulation in the sick leave law where you can't ask for a note once a person's missed 24 consecutive work hours. The idea is, yes, requiring an employee to submit a doctor's note claiming the employee to return to work will be job-related and consistent with the business necessity, because having an employee in the workplace not fully recovered from coronavirus would pose that direct threat. So it would not affect disability statutes from federal basis, state basis, does not interfere with the Massachusetts sick leave law. What should I do if an employee fears coming to work due to possible exposure in the workplace? Remember, there's the threat analysis that we walked through. but creating and implementing consistent plans for preventing and addressing potential workplace exposure, communicating these measures clearly and effectively will go a long way to reducing fears of workplace exposure. So employers should assess the specific risk in the workplace on a case-by-case basis. Currently, the federal guidance is focused on encouraging those who are sick or may have been exposed to stay home. In the event of a more particularized risk, such as an actual case of exposure to the coronavirus in the workplace, employers may wish to encourage or require working from home or to offer more lenient work from home options to their employees. So what the answer here is imploring you to do is be flexible. Don't get too hung up on current practice and policy. This is an emergency situation. Consider available options that you might not otherwise consider. Can an employee refuse to come to work because of fear of infection? We dealt with the imminent danger and we dealt with the decision-making process there associated with that. So I won't spend too much time answering that one, as I believe it's already been answered within the scope of the presentation. Although I will provide a more fully fleshed out answer for you in follow-up documents. Does family and medical leave, the current family and medical leave law, FMLA, apply to this situation? Here's why the emergency FMLA statute matters and is needed in this situation to address keeping folks home, is because generally employees are not entitled to take FMLA to stay at home to avoid getting sick. Where the purpose of this legislation is to do exactly that. We want folks to stay away from each other. So that's why the FMLA is written to address that. So the idea is to not get too hung up on that. As is often the case, an untrained supervisor can often immediately reject an unorthodox leave request before all the facts are in. So what we'd recommend is, in the absence of the federal law being passed and implemented for however long that takes, it could be 3 weeks from now. In the intervening time, make sure you do a considered analysis as to whether or not this person will be eligible for FMLA. One of my employees is traveling. May I ask him or her where they're going or where they have been? Now, generally speaking, you want to avoid this sort of inquiry because at the end of the day, you don't need to know that stuff. In this situation, though, you are permitted to inquire about the travel destinations, even if the travel is personal, because you're trying to maintain a safe and healthy workplace under your OSHA requirements. If you do start asking employees about their travel, though, make sure it's uniform. You don't want to start now incurring claims of disparate treatment based on protected classes. So if somebody's planning to go to China and you're only asking folks of Chinese origin whether or not they're going back to China, you can run into some national origin discrimination. May I instruct employees who have been to a region where coronavirus is prevalent or who otherwise believe they may have been exposed to stay home? The answer is yes. Employers may instruct employees who have traveled to a location where coronavirus is prevalent or who believe that they may have been exposed to stay home. But again, uniformly apply that. And if you do that, make sure that you're documenting the fact that you did do it. If I instruct an employee not to physically come to the office, do I have to pay him or her while he or she is at home? Now, this is a much more standard HR answer because the answer is it depends. It depends on their exemption status, Fair Labor Standards Act status of exempt, non-exempt, more commonly looked at as whether or not the person's salary or hourly. And then once that determination is made, is that person actually working when they're home? So if you've got an hourly employee who's not performing any work while home, that person is not entitled to any wages. However, if they are in fact working at home, the employee should be instructed to keep track of, be paid for all of their work hours. And oh, by the way, you still have your requirements to be providing that unpaid meal break. So best practice would be to have them communicating with you, emailing their hours regularly, daily. If I require an employee to stay home or the employee voluntarily chooses to self-quarantine, is the employee entitled to use his or her sick time? Massachusetts earned sick time law allows employees to earn sick time for several reasons, but not limited to caring for the employee's own physical or mental illness, injury, or other medical condition that requires home preventative or professional care, and caring for a child or sick parent. So if while at home the employee is not sick and not caring for a family member, they're not entitled to use sick time. Although you may choose to relax that given the pandemic emergency situation. Notwithstanding that, there is an argument to be made, untested, that such time away from the office could constitute preventative care and entitle the employee to use his or her sick time. So what I would suggest is be as flexible as you can in administering that. If an employee calls out sick, can I ask if they're experiencing symptoms of the coronavirus? The answer here is yes. Remember OSHA, remember the threat circumstance, but remember, if you do ask that, if you make that inquiry, you must do so formally. Make sure that you're documenting that and keep that in a file. So bear in mind that there are some consequences to that. Make sure you're keeping your documentation. If I force an employee to stay home or an employee chooses to self-quarantine, can I require the employee to use his or her paid time off? Follow your paid time off policies as written. So if you require your employees to use available paid time off regularly, you can do that. But again, it follows policy. To the extent that you may have a paid time off policy that lumps vacation and sick time together and the employee's absence does not qualify as an allowable purpose under the Earned Sick Time Law, you must be careful to ensure that your employees are nonetheless able to use up to 40 hours of paid time per year for purposes allowed under the law. Do not make your policy out of compliance with Mass Sick Law. What do I do if my supervisee has no sick time or vacation time available? We recommend supervisors work with staff to be flexible during the public health crisis. Individual plans should be brainstormed between the employee and signed off by a company director, supervisor, what have you. We're recommending that to demonstrate the flexibility of the situation, the unforeseen circumstances here. We're trying our very best here to mitigate the spread of the virus and exposure within your workplace. So your best practice is to be flexible and do your level best to accommodate that while you're maintaining your business. So, in sum, we've got a lot of preliminary information that's changing frequently. Plan for business interruptions. You're bound to have some. Have a plan in place to have employees working from home. Know what your minimum staffing requirements are. Know who your key employees are. Educate your supply chain. Make sure that the folks from whom you get services and goods know and understand what's happening within your organization. Attempt to schedule more teleconferences in lieu of travel. The fewer interactions you can have with folks, the better. If you're a publicly facing business, retail store, for instance, maintain your written cleaning plans. Remember, the federal response is not yet law, so there's all kinds of possibilities that may occur. The majority of this presentation is dealt with what do I have to know and be able to do right now. That may change with passing of a couple of different statutes. Remember that what we've just talked about, the emergency family medical leave, emergency sick leave, unemployment, those are just the first things. You can be assured that if this continues any length of time, that there will be additional legislation forthcoming. It's rapidly evolving. Please pay attention, and we will do our very best to be that trusted resource for you. You can ask employees to stay at home if they exhibit symptoms. You can ask an employee why they missed work, and you can ask them to leave work. Be sure to remember that you have this overarching responsibility to maintain that safe workplace. Here are some of the emergency response resources that I've talked about during the course of the presentation. We will make sure that you have access to all of these. You don't have to write them all down now. We'll make sure they get out. So the Bureau of Infectious Disease from the state, Massachusetts, you can call them, get some information. Similarly, at the bottom where it says Mass 211, you can call 211 and they have additional information as to resources as well. We have a bunch of interim guidance from the EOC and the Centers for Disease Control as well as OSHA. So with that, I'm going to hand it back off to Jim with one last statement. If you have a claim, benefits, or HR issue stemming from COVID, please email our rapid response team. We'll be sure to have somebody get back to you as quickly as possible.
Jay, thank you for the very informative and detailed presentation. Thank you all of you for participating in today's CIP webinar. We'll be sending out this webinar for your reference. Also, there were a number of questions that were asked today that we're not able to get to, but we will answer them and get you the answers out to you promptly. Every CIP employee is connected remotely and will continue to provide services to you. 3 years ago, we invested heavily in technology and implemented an emergency contingency plan that allows us to service our clients without interruption. Please contact your account manager or any contact you have within CIP with any questions, or you can utilize our new emergency corona response email called rapidresponse@askcip.com. Also, we will be having additional webinars as the COVID-19 issues and regulations continue to evolve. CIP has been in business for 32 years. Rest assured that if you need us, CIP will be there. Please stay safe and remember that this crisis will pass. Thank you again for allowing us to be your trusted benefits partner. Thank you.